Canada's lobbying commissioner is calling for more resources and some tightening of rules as she oversees the people who try to influence Ottawa's decision makers. And she's warning that lobbyists should make precautions when making partisan political commentary on TV panels and public appearances. Nancy Bélanger is a federal commissioner of lobbying, and in her latest report, she says there's at least one loophole that needs to be closed, while her office has also seen a doubling of lobbying activity in the past 5 years. Nancy Bélanger joins me now in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, let's start with, I talked about that loophole, and it's always quite interesting because, I mean, for people who don't know the Lobbyist Act, obviously lobbyists have to be registered and they also have to register their activity. But you raise an issue that has come up, and that is of sponsored travel for MPs and senators and lobbying that can go on without being registered during that travel. Explain.
Yes, well, in fact, the report my first report, investigation report that I tabled, what I noticed is that when there is lobbying occurring during sponsored travel, it is being recorded. It is in the registry. But what I was looking at is whether or not providing sponsored travel was against the code of lobbyists. And I found that it wasn't, because it is a rule, it is acceptable. Members of Parliament and senators have decided that it is acceptable. The loophole that I found is that it's not easily accessible for Canadians to know that that particular lobbying occurred during sponsored travel. Unless you do an exercise of verifying the registry of sponsored travel versus the lobbying registry, you would not know that it occurred at that time. And that's the loophole that I would like to have fixed.
Because generally lobbyists have to register. I had this meeting with a deputy minister, I had this meeting with a minister and all that, and specify where it took place and what was discussed.
Well, it would not. It usually doesn't necessarily say where. It says when. Yeah. And what I'd like to add is a context under which that this had occurred during sponsored travel.
Why is that important?
I think it's for transparency. I think for me, the context is as much information that we can provide Canadians as to what decision makers have in their context and the information that they have in front of them when they do make decisions. And if lobbying occurred during sponsored travel, it would be important to know that for Canadians to know that it happened on this trip.
Okay, another point I mentioned in the introduction to you is that if you look at the figures, there's been a real increase in the number of lobbying activities in terms of actual meetings and all that. It's almost doubled since 2014.
Yes, and I think that's a good thing. That means that decision makers are opening the doors. Lobbying is a legitimate activity. Decision makers are opening the doors to listen, different perspectives, different opinions, different positions, different interests, and these are being registered. That means lobbyists are abiding and are compliant with the requirements of the Act.
But you mentioned that some people say this is self-serving, but you mentioned that your budget isn't keeping up to it. Your office is not keeping up to that growth in lobbying activities.
Yes, I am concerned because the budget was set back in 2008. And it has an increase. I have a statutory obligation to maintain a registry. As you well know, IT today costs a lot more today than it did 10 years ago. So I am concerned with resources in the office. We have a multitude of mandate. We have like threefold in our mandate, not just the registry, but compliance exercises and as well as outreach. And so with a team of 27 employees, it's starting to be stretched thin.
So that's a request that a lot of officers of Parliament make. You make that to the government of the day, and the government would have to bring that in the next budget.
I sure hope so. I'm going to be working with Treasury Board during the course of the summer and likely in the fall to hopefully be in the budget next year.
Another interesting point that was made in this, well, it wasn't in this report, but you have done it, you're on the record as setting out some warnings to lobbyists who take part in political activities. And for us, this is of great interest, especially sitting around a set like this in TV and being political commentators. If you're a lobbyist, you warn them about how to avoid it being a high-risk activity. What's your warning to lobbyists sitting on a set like this one?
Yeah, well, the first thing I will say is that lobbyists are entitled to do political activities. My job is not to hinder that in any way, shape, or form. But my warning to them is if you are going to engage in political activities, whether it's sitting on a panel or participating in fundraising, you are creating a sense of obligation for that person that you're either supporting or that you've helped being elected. And at the end of the day, that may restrict the lobbying activity that you can do in the future. And that's the warning, is be careful of the positions that you take, or that the support you issue publicly, so that the decision maker doesn't feel like they owe you something.
So what's the distinction? You make a distinction of how lobbyists should identify themselves and how they should be identified on, for example, a television show like this.
They should be careful of how they identify themselves and how the commentary, the public comments that they make. I mean, if they are very clearly supporting a particular client or a particular position, they should be straightforward as to who they represent and if they're doing it in their personal capacity.
But on a personal basis.
They should be doing it on a personal basis.
As opposed to if you are named as an official spokesperson of the party, you then call that a high-risk activity.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so avoid maybe, or know that you're running a risk of if you are identified as an official party spokesperson.
That's right. You should avoid identifying yourself as an official spokesperson for a party. But even if you are doing it in your personal capacity, you should also be concerned about the clients that you represent and what activity you will be doing afterwards. So it is a warning, and I tell them, call our office so we can help you to make sure you remain in compliance.
Couldn't have an interview with a lobbying commissioner without talking to something which you mentioned in your annual report, and that is a court case that's now ongoing, and that is the case of the Aga Khan and the invitation to the Prime Minister to spend time over Christmas at his private island. The Ethics Commissioner found that the Prime Minister was in violation of ethics guidelines. Your predecessor, Karen Shepherd, was asked to look into the lobbying rules and whether Aga Khan should be bound by lobbying rules. She decided that the Aga Khan shouldn't be bound by the Lobbying Act because he was not at risk of having immediate remuneration. The federal court ruled that that was too narrow an interpretation, asked your office to look into it again with a wider interpretation, the Aga Khan and his foundation. Where does that case stand? We understand that's now been put on hold. Your review of the case has been put on hold.
The review of the case has been put on hold. I will abide by the decision of the Federal Court of Appeal. It has now been appealed. The impact of that decision is to say now that simply being a volunteer on a board of directors possibly means that you're subject to the Lobbying Act and the Code of Conduct. That will have serious implications or a great impact on the number of individuals out there who are volunteers on boards. So I will abide by that decision if the Federal Court of Appeal decides that it stands, but for now it's status quo until I have that decision.
Because the federal government is appealing that ruling.
Yes, it has appealed that ruling. In fact, I think the factum for the Attorney General has been filed, and it's a matter of time before the other side, and likely a hearing in the fall.
So we will wait to see what happens.
Absolutely, we will wait to see what happens.
Okay, Nancy Bélanger, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much for the invitation.